and Lake Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. So we are the newest and hopefully, well, we think we're the best of the fire science exchanges. There are fire science exchanges all across the country that are supported by JSSP, and we all help to facilitate communication between fire scientists and managers in our region. Our region is a pretty unique one in a lot of ways. As you can see on this map, we have a lot of gray urban area, and as many of you are quite familiar, we have a lot of forest fragmentation and sprawl and fire history that's different from quite a lot of what you see in other regions. So we have high population densities and very diverse land ownership, which makes fire science and safe implementation in fire management kind of a unique challenge in the North Atlantic region. We try to catalyze collaboration between scientists and land managers and innovate and facilitate communication and help synthesize existing research that is applicable to the North Atlantic. We do this through research briefs. Hopefully you all are on our list. We have a couple really good ones coming out in advance of our Oak Capstone Workshop, which will be happening June 15th to 16th in Westborough, Massachusetts. We also offer newsletters, webinars such as this one. We have a really good website. You should check it out if you haven't yet. A research database, field trips, such as the one you can see in this picture. And again, the capstone workshops. We had a great one in November in New Jersey, and we're looking forward to our oak-focused capstone workshop in June in Massachusetts. This is our leadership team. We're lucky to have folks from the U.S. Forest Service as well as myself representing the nonprofit sector, and Dr. Ingela Puma, who's with Rutgers with the academic side. And we have tons of awesome community representatives who help keep us informed about fire science and management needs in their neck of the woods and also in their various agencies and organizations. We want to get started on our real webinar. So I'll just conclude by showing you this slide, which has our website at the bottom, firesciencenorthatlantic.org. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Dave King. So just give me a moment to give the floor, and all right. Dave King. Dr. King is a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station and also adjunct associate professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His interests are in applied conservation research, including the effects of forest management, climate change, urbanization, habitat restoration, and agroforestry on wildlife, with a particular interest and expertise in the full life cycle conservation of neotropical migrant birds. So Dave, we're thrilled to have you offer this webinar today on fauna and fire at the Montague Plains. Take it away, Dave.
Terrific. Well, thanks a lot, Amanda, and thanks everybody for tuning in. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about 12 or so years of research that we've been doing up at Montague. So I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of Joan Milam, adjunct researcher here at the University of Massachusetts in the Environmental Conservation Department, specialist in bee taxonomy, ecology, and conservation. And Mike Ackrush, a graduate student of mine, has also made a lot of contributions towards this research effort. And so to structure the talk today, I'll talk a little bit about an introduction to the Montague Plains for those of you who aren't familiar with the site, talk about its ecological characteristics, and then some issues having to do with fire and fuels that will really provide the context for a lot of the research on fauna that I'll describe to you today. I'm going to go through and discuss several studies that we've conducted over the years, a couple of community-level studies on songbirds, native bees, and then a couple of individual species, hognose snakes, whippoorwills, and for each one of those, I'll provide a little introduction and context about why we're concerned about those communities, those taxa or species, a little bit about our approach, research approach, results and methods, and then at the end, I'll sum it all up, pretty much a conclusion based on the entire body of research. So the Montague Plains Wildlife Management Area is an area that's owned by the Massachusetts Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. It's in Montague, Massachusetts, in the Connecticut River Valley. It's in western Massachusetts. It's a xeric outwash plain, and it consists of a fan of sand and gravel that was deposited from a river flowing into Glacial Lake Hitchcock. So it's got a number of really interesting and unique characteristics in relation to the rest of Massachusetts and the region, well, certainly the rest of the inland portions of the region, in that it's very flat, it's very xeric, the soils are extremely nutrient poor, and the system as a whole is really fire prone. This is based on the fact that it's got 100 or more feet of sand throughout it. And this really does contrast with the surrounding areas in Massachusetts. So as the result of its unique geology and xeric characteristics and edaphic characteristics, the Montague Plains has developed a really unique plant community, a pitch pine scrub oak barrens community. And so this is dominated by a couple of species, Pinus rigida, pitch pine, and Quercus ilicifolia, scrub oak. And these are species that can tolerate these droughty conditions, nutrient-poor soils, and they're also very fire-tolerant. They have adaptations to resist the effects of fire. Pitch pine is very thick, platy bark, epicormic sprouting to help it recover from fire, and scrub oak has a really deep, well-developed root system that enables it to mobilize nutrients in order to resprout rapidly after fire. So this is the ecological context in which these faunal studies are taking place. So we're interested in these pitch pine scrub oak barrens for a number of reasons, one of which is that they're considered globally threatened. So here's an example of a historical reconstruction of the conversion of pine plains in the Chicopee area that was reconstructed by Glenn Motzkin, and illustrates the rapid conversion and loss of these ecosystems in the region. So in the leftmost panel, you can see a sketch map from 1830 that indicates that there are pine plains were widespread in the region. In the next panel from 1937, pine plains are really only represented by those relatively small patches of black. The rest of it has either been converted to urban or agricultural uses. And then you can see that by 1985, the pine plains are reduced to very small, little isolated fragments. And so overall, about 90% of this ecosystem or more has been lost over time. And what does exist is typically in small patches, the Montague Plains being an exception. So as well as conversion, there's also another threat to these pine barrens is fire suppression. And fire suppression allows non-fire tolerant species like maples and birches, for instance, to become established at the site. And those both directly displace pitch pine and scrub oak, but they also actually can alter the fire regime. Oaks and pines tend to have a foliage that's high in cellulose and lignin content, and as a result, the leaves are rigid and they create a very aerated litter layer that provides a really good bed for the ignition ignition of fire. In contrast, maples and birches, they have really high compaction ratios, so when maple and birch leaves fall on the ground, they create a soggy mat that retards fire. So, and that actually creates a kind of feedback loop of mesification that can further result in the conversion or the loss of these habitats, the loss of the distinctive characteristics of these plant communities. Fire suppression also threatens human life and property. So Andy Fenton did a study where he followed a number of different, or he reconstructed the history of a number of different plains, sand plains in the area, and reported that sand plains in their historical condition consisted of relatively open conditions where you have relatively scattered pitch pine in a bed of scrub oak and heaths and grasses. And over time, with fire suppression, you end up in a situation where you have a closed canopy pine forest, and that's illustrated in the lower right-hand panel there. So that's a closed canopy pine forest, pitch pine forest that's result from fire exclusion. And so this is pretty serious issues from the perspective of human health and safety, in that those close canopy pine forests, they're susceptible. They have a lot of ladder fuels, and they're susceptible to running crown fires. And there's a number of catastrophic examples of catastrophic fire, both in the region of Montague, but also here on the Cape in 1957. There was a fire that got loose in pitch pine forest and burned 15,000 acres in something like 24 hours, and it only stopped because it ran into the ocean. There was nothing left to burn. There's millions of people in the Northeast that live within proximity to these pine barrens, so we're really concerned about that. Because of this concern, there's been a lot of work done at Montague in terms of ameliorating these effects, a lot of it by Dr. William Patterson, UMass, and students of his, Matt Duveneck and others, developing approaches towards ameliorating this fire effect through thinning, and a lot of this is done with measurements, fuels measurements and modeling. That it has essentially developed a prescription illustrated in the lower right-hand corner, where pitch pine scrub oak forest has been thinned to reduce the rate of running crown fires, and that has been successful. I should also note that, as we saw from that earlier slide, that this also brings the system to resemble more closely the historical conditions in which a pitch pine scrub oak barren would occur, and we anticipate that it would probably benefit the species that are historically present in these sites. Scrub oak is also another type of fuel that's considered pretty dangerous. Scrub oak is it's been likened to chaparral in terms of its flammability, and so there are also a lot of research done at Montague at approaches towards reducing the fire risk in this type of fuels habitat. And so those include different regimes of mowing and prescribed fire. And so a recently burned site, well, on the left side is a site that hasn't been managed for a good long while, and on the right is a recently burned site. And it should also be noted that the recently regenerating scrub oak has foliage that's much more palatable. It has less secondary components, and so it's much more palatable for a lot of the endangered Lepidoptera. I think there's like 14 species of rare moths that occur on the site. So there's all this activity that's directed at changing the structure and species composition of the habitat out there on Montague. And so in 2004, we embarked on a program of study to evaluate the effects of these management activities on distinctive fauna of the sand plains. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we did a couple of community-level studies of songbirds, exemplified by this prairie warbler in the upper left, native pollinators, native bees, that could be a Halictus ligatus, and as well as hognose snakes and whippoorwills. And so generally speaking, our approach was to compare the abundance or diversity or performance of these different taxa among these different conditions. Up in the upper left-hand corner, again, is that dog-hair thick pitch pine forest that's probably an artifact of fire exclusion. On the upper right, you can see that's a thinned pitch pine forest. Lower left is scrub oak. And then on the lower right-hand corner, that's mature deciduous forest that pretty much characterizes most of western Massachusetts and a lot of New England. The idea of including that is to, in general, to illustrate the distinctive characteristics of the pitch pine scrub oak barrens community in terms of its fauna. So we started out by evaluating the effects of these management practices on songbirds. So Montague's got a pretty diverse songbird community, ranging from black-capped chickadees, resident species like black-capped chickadees, to short-distance migrants like eastern towhees, and then to neotropical migrants like catbirds, common yellowthroats, chestnut-sided warblers, and prairie warblers. So we used pretty much standard methods for surveying birds of the Montague Plains. We had we selected 80 points among those 4 treatments I mentioned: deciduous forest, pitch pine, treated pitch pine, and scrub oak. Did surveys during the height of the breeding season. from 2004 to 2008. And these consisted of standard 10-minute, 50-meter radius point counts during which an observer would record all the birds they saw or heard. 3 visits per season at each point enabled us to correct these point counts for imperfect detection using mixture models. And so during the course of the study, we observed 60 species of birds, of which 12 of them were abundant enough to actually analyze these mixture models. A bunch of others we analyzed using Poisson regression, and I'm not going to present those results. I think for the purposes of the talk, heuristic purposes, I think that the mixture model surveys will be, results will be sufficient. But so just starting out with birds that are most abundant in unthinned pitch pine, for instance, black-capped chickadees and ovenbirds. These are abundance estimates here on the y-axis, and these are the 4 different habitats. And these abundance estimates at 95% confidence intervals. So you can see black-capped chickadees and ovenbirds were most abundant in pitch pine forest and less abundant in treated pitch pine forest. And that suggests that these species anyway would be negatively affected by the thinning to reduce fire structure and restore the habitat, fire risk and restore the structure of the habitat. Hermit thrushes and pine warblers are also more abundant in pitch pine. These weren't significant compared to treated pitch pine. In contrast, there are several species that were more abundant in thin pitch pine than the other habitats, though due to the variability of the estimates. These weren't really significant, but red American robins, chipping sparrows, and field sparrows were all most abundant in treated pitch pine. And then finally, there were a number of species that were most abundant in scrub oak habitat. And notably, a couple of these species, like prairie warblers and eastern towhees, were also very abundant in the treated pitch pine. So these species were most abundant in the scrub oak shrubland, and several of them were also present or also abundant in the treated pitch pine. And so here you have a situation where you have some birds that are positively affected, some birds that are negatively affected by the management, and some are positively affected. How do you really make a judgment or determination in terms of the effect, in terms of the conservation value of these and effect of these management practices? Well, one way is putting it in a regional context. And if you look here on the left-hand side, here is the percentage of early successional habitat. This is FIA data over time for the 6 New England states. And you can see that in every state except Maine, the amount of early successional habitat has been declining over time. Maine's an exception, but we don't have prairie warblers or towhees up there, so those habitats are not supporting the species that we're concerned about here. So we're really down to probably record lows of early successional habitat on the landscape in this region. And also, if you look at the results of the North American Breeding Bird Survey for the region, and you look at the proportion of species that are exhibiting declining trends, that's this dark color, versus increasing trends, that's this light color, you can see that these early successional species are actually a larger proportion of these early successional species are undergoing declines, about 75%, than these mature forest species. Now, we're very concerned about these mature forest species, but it just goes to show that those early successional species that are being benefited by these treatments, that certainly is worth consideration from a conservation standpoint. So to summarize this portion of the study, so field control benefits some species and harms others. But the species that are least abundant in these treated habitats are widely distributed and stable. You don't have to go too far to find a black-capped chickadee. And ovenbirds, you know, although they're unique and fabulous mature forest birds, we're not concerned about them at the regional scale. In contrast, the species that are most abundant in those treated habitats, like scrub oak and treated pitch pine, those are locally restricted and declining species. So the species like prairie warblers and eastern towhees, those are listed in a lot of state wildlife action plans, and so they really are species of regional concern. And so based on the fact that these treatment practices are really benefiting those species probably that need conservation attention the most, based on that we conclude that these practices are providing a net benefit to regional bird diversity. So that's the bird community work. We also embarked on a study of native bees at the Montague Plains. And so we're interested in native bees for a number of reasons. First of all, they're an important component of biodiversity. There's about 375 species of bees in Massachusetts. Some of these species appear to be undergoing declines. For instance, a bee that was formerly common, a bumblebee, Bombus affinis, that's the rusty-patched bumblebee. That is a species that used to be widespread, and now it's essentially vanished from large portions of its range. A lot of these species, their trends in abundance and status is unknown. So a lot of these species could actually be going extinct or declining without us even knowing. So from a biodiversity component perspective, we're concerned about bees. And also, of course, in terms of food security and agriculture, native bees really contribute a lot to pollination of a lot of crops that we rely on for food. So we embarked on a bee study. And so, again, we used relatively standard methods. We sampled 50 points among 5 treatments. And so we had the untreated pitch pine, treated pitch pine, scrub oak, and for the purposes of this project, we also added gravel pits. There's a number of them on the Montague Plains, and power line rights-of-ways, because other studies have shown that bees are abundant in these sites. And so we worked on bees from 2008 to 2010, from April to October. We used 70-meter transects, and we used bee bowls. And so this is an illustration of a bee bowl. It's just a salsa cup with filled about 3/4 of the way with a solution of water and dish soap to break the surface tension. Bees think it's a flower. They fly in there, and they get trapped, and they can later be collected and identified. And so we had 15 bowls per transect, and they alternated white, fluorescent yellow, and fluorescent blue, because those are colors that we know attract bees. Put each transect out for 24 hours during nice weather. And we supplemented those with 30-minute sweep samples with a net. Here's Joan with a net collecting bees, because large-bodied bees tend not to use these bowls, and they tend to be undersampled. So for the community-level study, we really wanted to supplement that with sweeps. So we did 3 samples per year, except the first year where we did 9, in order to establish the phenology, the bee phenology, so we'd know whether or not 3 samples, where to put our 3 samples to make sure we reflected the entire bee community. So we ended up capturing a little over 5,000 individual bees of 154 species. This included 7 state records and 1 species new to science. This is Lasioglossum sonunculum. This species was captured, and Joan ran it through the keys and wasn't able to figure out what it was, so she sent it to Jason Gibbs, and he determined that indeed it was a new species of bee. Interestingly, well, it's a parasitic bee. It's got these huge, scary mandibles that it uses to rip into the nest chambers of its hosts. And interestingly, the bee we found it in treated pitch pine and also in gravel pits. So it suggests that it's a species that's going to benefit from management that's going on at Montague. We also found 1 exotic species, Osmia taurus, and not much is known about this bee, and so definitely in the long term it'll be interesting to keep an eye on it and see whether or not numbers of Osmia taurus increase or not. Okay, now I guess I switch over to the other deck, not that slide. Okay, and so we did a comparison among these different habitats of bee abundance. And so let me walk you through this slide. The y-axis here is bee abundance, so that's the mean number of bees per transect. And this is for the 10 most abundant bee species. And for each one of these bee species, there's 5 columns corresponding to its abundance in each one of these habitats. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'd just like to pay attention to this maroon bar and this purple bar here, because this maroon bar is untreated pitch pine, this purple bar is treated pitch pine. And you can see that for every one of these species, Lasioglossum versatum, Lysoglossum catherinii, Pneumata maculatum, Lysoglossum Lysoglossum pilosum, Lysoglossum crisoni, Agricola aurata, Lysoglossum tegulare, Agapastomum texanus, and Osmia virga. All of those species were more abundant in the treated pitch pine than they were in the untreated pitch pine forest. And one exception to this is Lysoglossum subviridatum, which was still pretty abundant in treated pitch pine. So that suggests to us that for these 10 most abundant bee species, that they actually are benefiting from the treatments, the habitat restoration, fuels reduction treatments going on at Montague.
Hey, Dave, just sorry to interrupt. Just a quick reminder: the pointer tool, you actually have to click down for us to see the arrow.
Beg your pardon?
Oh, the pointer tool. If you're using the pointer, you have to click on. Remember, you have to click on.
Oh, I can't just drag it.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you click, we can see.
Oh yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Well,
Would you mind just saying which again was the maroon bar and the purple bar that you were asked us to look at?
Yeah. So this right here is the second one. Sorry, this thing's kind of hard to manage. So there's a maroon bar. That's untreated pitch pine, and there's the purple bar. That's treated pitch pine. And so for each one of these species, you can see that the abundance is lower in the untreated pitch pine and higher in the treated pitch pine. The exception to that is Lysoglossum tegulare, and the abundance of that species is the same in untreated pitch pine as it is in treated pitch pine. But for most of these bee species, their abundance is actually far higher in the thinned pitch pine compared to the unthinned pitch pine.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for reminding me that. I've been pointing all over the place, and you guys have not even been seeing it. Sorry about that. Okay. And so we're also able to look at the effect of fuels control within the scrub oak. And again, you can see in this slide the abundance of these species in untreated scrub oak is lower for all species compared to the treated scrub oak. And again, that's true for every species except subviridatum, which was actually far more abundant in untreated scrub oak compared to treated scrub oak. But remember, that bee was pretty abundant in both untreated and treated pitch pine. So anyway, from this, again, we conclude that the habitat treatments are benefiting the bees at this level, bee abundance. So we also had an opportunity to look at the effects of the acute effects of fire on bees. There was a number of points that we had where we did sampling over the course of the season. Again, this is on the y-axis. This is number of bees. Number of bees per transect, and these are 9 sampling periods starting in April. And you can see the blue line there, this bottom line here, that is control. That's control points over time. And this red here, this is a site that was burned during the 7th sampling period. You can see that the number of Lysoglossum considered as a group skyrocketed after that fire. And so it suggests that these bees are responding positively to fire. We are entertaining the possibility that the bolls are actually more visible with a reduction of the cover. And so that's something we're looking into to see whether or not that's actually an artifact of the reduction of the structure of the habitat on the catchability of bees. So in conclusion, with regard to bees, the bees are scarce or absent from coast canopy forests, with at least one exception. And bees were more abundant in thin pitch pine forest compared to the untreated pitch pine forest. And the bees were more abundant in treated scrub oak in comparison to untreated stands. So there's a really, so it looks like both the fuels reduction treatments in pitch pine forest and in scrub oak are benefiting bees. And Montague Plains in general has a distinctive bee fauna that's characterized by rare and new species. So that's it for bees. I'd like to next discuss some work that we've done on eastern hognose snakes. And so eastern hognose snakes are species that are typically associated with sandy habitats like barrens. They're a burrowing snake, and so they really are strongly associated with these habitats. You can see in the Pioneer Valley here, there's a number of locations. This is from the Mass Herp Atlas, and here's Montague up here. And so these dark blue polygons are actually confirmed sightings of hognose snakes. And you can see they have a pretty restricted distribution within the state. And so we're a little concerned about them because, you know, they're associated with sandy habitats and like barrens, and barrens are declining. And so we undertook a study of hognose snakes, and we used radio telemetry and also these passive transponder tags. And so we conducted this study across 30 points, distributed among those 4 treatments: pitch pine, treated pitch pine, scrub oak, and deciduous forest. And we captured or tried to capture snakes using pitfall traps, cover boards, and directed searches, and none of those actually worked. It turned out that Mike Ackrish's team, when they were out looking for prairie warbler nests, they actually found the majority of the snakes in this study. The study was conducted between 2008 and 2012. And so in the course of the study, we we tagged 46 snakes with these passive transponder tags. And 93% of these captures were in open habitats. But you got to keep in mind that prairie warblers are a shrubland bird, and because most of the encounters were the result of researchers looking for prairie warbler nests, that is potentially overrepresents these open habitats. We never got any recaptures. So these passive transponder tags, they're small, about the size of a grain of rice. They're little electronic devices you insert under the skin in a snake, and you have a scanning device that you bring out that's like a barcode reader, and you can determine whether a snake that you capture has been previously tagged. We didn't recapture any. We put out 12 radios, and over the study period, we observed 3 mortalities that were all predation. And this resulted in our estimate of a 61% annual mortality based on program mark. So here are some results for the telemetry. Over all 12 snakes, we ended up with almost 300 locations of snakes. 84% of these were in open habitats, so that's a lot better measure than pit tags because it wasn't dependent on search effort. And so this diagram here, this illustrates the Montague Plains, and these polygons are snake home ranges. And so, the colors underneath, the colors and patterns underneath are the different habitat types. For instance, this crosshatch stuff is pitch pine. This gray stuff is treated pitch pine. And this light gray is scrub oak. And so, based on an analysis of these locations, we found that although a number of these snakes actually did, these little circles are actually snake locations, a number of these snakes actually did occur from time to time within closed canopy pitch pine forest. Overall, they avoided it. If you look at the proportion of pitch pine forest that was available, they avoided deciduous forest, power line rights-of-ways, and pitch pine forest on a statistical basis anyway, and they selected scrub oak and treated pitch pine at a higher rate than its availability on the landscape. So based on that, we concluded that there was an association of these snakes with these open habitats, and that's not really a big surprise. They're reptiles. They're cold-blooded, and so they depend on thermal energy from the sun for a lot of different things to enhance mobility, and also it helps in the development of their young there. They lay eggs in duff piles out in the open, and the increased temperatures associated with low canopy cover help with the development of the young. So we can conclude that snakes appear to be plentiful on the Montague Plains. If you accept the recapture rate, we put out 46 passive transponder tags and never caught a marked snake, that suggests that the population is pretty big. It's also possible they could be shedding the tags. They selected target habitats for fuels control and restoration, that is the thinned pitch pine and the scrub oak. They avoided unthinned forest. And so this suggests, again, that management is benefiting these hognose snakes. Interesting, so the mortalities we observed were all predation of target snakes, of marked snakes. Those were all predation, but we did encounter 4 snakes that weren't part of the study that were roadkills. And so these are just dirt tracks going through the sand plains, and it really does suggest that it's probably worthwhile from the perspective of snake conservation to close down those roads wherever you can. And actually the Mass Wildlife is actually engaged in that effort right now. And so the final study I'd like to talk to you about is habitat-specific abundance and nest site selection of whippoorwills. So whippoorwills are a charismatical bird. They're nocturnal insect-eating birds. And by any measure, they declined over time. So if you look at the bird atlas from Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bird Atlas, regional bird atlases, or in this case, the Massachusetts Breeding Bird Survey, you can see that they've undergone pretty big declines over time. If you talk to anybody about whippoorwills and they know anything about them, the first thing they'll tell you is, oh, they used to be here, now they're not. So we're really pretty concerned about whippoorwills. They've actually recently been listed as a species of special concern in Massachusetts. So we are interested in knowing in understanding how these land management practices affected whippoorwills. And so we had 2 parts of this. The first part was habitat-specific abundance. And the way we went about this is largely the same as for the way we went about songbirds. We did this over a couple of years. We had 24 points among these 4 target habitats. We used 10-minute point counts, 3 visits per point among these 4 habitats. And again, these multiple visits allowed us to correct these estimates for imperfect detection. And so in terms of habitat-specific abundance, here are the results. These are estimates of abundance in the y-axis among closed canopy forests, scrub oak, and treated pitch pine. And the deciduous and pitch pine forest are combined for the purpose of this analysis because there weren't enough birds in either habitat to consider separately. And so the results, these are abundance results again with 95% confidence intervals. And you can see that the birds are most abundant in scrub oak. And so these are for 2 years. The 2 years were considered separately, and but they are also present in pretty good numbers in the treated pitch pine. We're interested in looking at nesting habitat for a couple of reasons. There's this perception in the literature based on a report from 1941 that whippoorwills nest in closed canopy forest and forage in the open. And there's not really a lot of quantitative data on whippoorwill nesting at all. And what little there is tends to be equivocal, or so we're not really sure whether or not whippoorwills require both forest and to nest in and open habitats to forage in. And so we're very interested in looking at nesting. And so over the course of his work with prairie warblers, Mike Akers, between 2008 and 2013, was continuously running into whippoorwill nests. And so he monitored those carefully to determine whether or not they were successful or not. And then he measured habitat at these sites to try and characterize whippoorwill nests because we know so little about whippoorwill nesting. And what he found 26 nests and 59 roost sites. And of those, 92% were in open areas. Okay, so that's not surprising because Mike was looking for an open area bird. But still, it shows that the birds are not just nesting in mature forests; they also nest out in these open areas. Nest survival was 63%, which is pretty respectable for a ground nesting bird, and he found that nests tended to be relatively close to trees. So from the perspective of whippoorwill conservation, so whippoorwills were most abundant in scrub oak and also in thin pitch pine. And so again, this supports the importance of these habitats to the conservation of the species. they were scarce or absent in those closed canopy forests, and at least some birds nest and roost in open areas. And tree retention could be a key. Some of those studies that have reported that whippoorwills nest in forests and not in open areas were studying open areas that didn't have trees in them. So maybe the fact that there's some tree retention facilitates nesting of whippoorwills out in the open at Montague. That's certainly something that would be worth looking at in the longer term. And generally speaking, the whippoorwill results are important because of the 5 focal areas in Massachusetts that have really decent numbers of whippoorwills. Montague is one of them. They're all on sand plains or in xeric fire-dependent ecosystems like sand plains or oak forests. So in conclusion, based on this multi-taxa program of study on the effects of fuel reduction, habitat restoration on these species, we concluded that these practices support songbirds, a regional conservation concern, those shrubland birds that we're so concerned about. They promote a distinctive bee fauna. The site itself is distinctive in terms of harboring a lot of unique species and abundance of at least the more common bee species is higher in these treated habitats, and we're currently engaged in analyzing the data at a more fine-grained level. These practices create preferred habitat for hognose snakes, probably as a result of their thermoregulatory needs, and it provides foraging and nesting habitat for whippoorwills. So that concludes the body of the presentation, and we'd like to acknowledge the support of the Mass Agricultural Experiment Station, Max Dennis Funds, also the Forest Service National Fire Plan. We appreciate access to the site and cooperation of the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and additional funds were received from the American Wildlife Conservation Foundation.
Wonderful. Dave, thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. It's amazing that you covered so many taxa in such a short time. Thank you.
So there's a couple studies we did include for later.
Yeah, maybe a future webinar. But yeah, great. Thank you so much. I'm sure we have very loud virtual applause going on the phone line. We have a few questions that came in the chat box. The first one was from Bob Cummins, and back in the bird section. So he asks, in terms of net benefit for the birds, how is this valued? He says, I'm not a wildlife person, but I would imagine there's a factor that includes species diversity, numbers or total biomass, success of invasives or indigenous. Maybe there's other factors related to the distribution.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and it's a lot of work has gone into this. And one good place, probably where the best source is probably the Partners in Flight program. So that's a multi-agency bird conservation program, and they've gone through ranking all native species based on their population trends, their vulnerability, and also the proportion of their populations that are supported within a given physiographic region. And so it's sort of an objective measure of bird conservation value. So that's one way of looking at it. And if you look at that, these shrubland birds like prairie warblers tend to rank pretty high on those scales. Also, if you look at species of greatest conservation need, as reflected in the state wildlife action plans, those shrubland birds tend to rank high on that scale too. And then if you just look at the distribution of shrubland birds in Massachusetts in the Northeast, and you look at trends in terms of their habitat availability as well as their population trends, you can see that these species are declining, and we've concluded on the basis of all those that they are pretty vulnerable. And that's not to say that we're not still concerned about mature forest bird species, and there's all kinds of efforts, great efforts underway to maintain secure core areas of forest, of mature forest, to support those species.
Oh, excellent. We have a few more questions coming in. Let's see. The next one that came in was about hognose snakes from Laura. She says, did hognose snakes used to be more widespread in Massachusetts?
I would assume so, given the fact that they're associated with sand plains habitat that were historically more abundant. And then probably those, well, yeah, yep, I think so. And at previous times in history, there's been more shrubland habitat too, open habitat that probably facilitates, their breeding.
Great. I see a follow-up question that just came in from Jonathan. To follow up on hognose snakes, why do you think that they did not utilize right-of-ways?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, they could be shadier. Ground could be more compacted.
He also adds, given that right-of-ways tend to offer similar habitat types.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe, I mean, they could be closer to forest. I can't remember. I think that we were thinking they might be more subject to predation from animals occupying the adjacent forest. I'm not sure we really know.
Good, thank you. Yeah, good question. Let's see, we had another question come in about bees. So Bob asked, thinking about bees, their numbers are correlated. Is that related to no food sources under a closed canopy or something else correlated to an open canopy?
Let's see, why bees are open? It's probably floral resources largely. Yeah, Joan's nodding, yeah. It probably has to do with floral resources that are just more abundant in those.
And the bees are going to be more abundant in forests with the spring ephemerals. Let's believe that clearly.
Yeah, so it's probably floral resources. I think bee abundance in the forest might be higher during the period when spring ephemeral flowers are around. But I think at Montague Plains it's associated with floral resources. Those heaths, for instance, have a lot of flowers.
Okay, great, thanks. The next question actually came in via email from Robert Soames in New Jersey. He says, I would like to find out more information on the bee data and surveys. Are there any publications available? We recently received a competitive SWG grant to conduct rare bee research and surveys jointly with Rutgers University. Currently, it is a broad sweeping survey, but it might be interesting to refine it a little and do some targeted surveys looking at areas with different management and fire histories in a year or two. So I think, yeah, looking for publications or information about the bee survey process and data.
So that's underway. There is a Mass Agricultural Experiment Station report that exists that I could furnish, but I think we're still developing the data, so it isn't published yet. But hopefully, it will be soon.
Okay, great, thank you. There was another question about monitoring protocol. Laura asked if there's a way to get a copy of the Whippoorwill monitoring protocol.
Sure. Let's see. I think it's in that paper, which is, I think it's in that paper, but if you really, there's also a standard Whippoorwill monitoring protocol. It's a 6-minute protocol that was developed by the Whippoorwill Working Group. And so we used a 10-minute point count because the Whippoorwill survey protocol, the standardized one, hadn't been developed yet. But it might be worth considering using that 6-minute protocol because it would be, you'd be able to share data, compare data with the broader research effort. And I could find that. If someone wants to send me an email, I could find that. I could direct them to that information.
Yeah, Laura says that she's been using the 6-minute protocol. She says, I was wondering if you were also using those parameters of the moon and sky conditions.
Oh, we tried to, but couldn't always do it. So we entered moon phase as a covariate in the analysis to try and account for the fact that whippoorwills typically call less when moon's farther away from being full.
Got it. Great. And she says, okay, thanks. And also, Pete Grima plugged in a URL that looks like, well, I didn't follow it, but it might be helpful in answering that question.
Yeah, nicely done.
Yeah. And by the way, Dave, if you want to share, and Joan, if you have publications or things that you'd like to share, we could post stuff on the NASI website as well. And we're happy, and if you're willing, we could share your contact information. Folks can ask you questions directly. Let's see. We had another question that came in. Let's see. So Tanner asks, is tree retention equal across all sites as a standard prescription, or is it more site-specific related to existing stand conditions about pitch pine thinning?
Yeah, I think that's a question for Dr. Passon or Brian Hawthorne. In the Northeast Barrens website that I had up there, if you just type in Northeast Barrens, it'll bring you to a UMass site that has a lot of information on that. And it's got, for instance, the management plan for Montague with a lot of detail. It's got links to all kinds of stuff about fuels, fire and fuels, Northeast Barrens.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm thinking we might want to open up the phone line in a minute and let, if Dr. Patterson is willing to speak for a bit to answer that question. I also just got another one in that might be a Bill question from an email that came in saying, this is from Laura Eaton with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in New Hampshire. She says, I recently saw a webinar that showed some photos of a, quote, roasted box turtle after prescribed fire, raising the issue of immediate impacts to declining species. I was wondering, when your treatment prescribed fire was conducted, are they early spring or late fall or during the active season? Should we be concerned about the immediate impacts of fire? So would that be a Dr. Patterson question?
No, I think it's something that we've given, well, about the timing of the fire, yeah. But I think if you consider that there wouldn't be hognose snakes at the site if it weren't managed, I think that's one issue. And so it's certainly worth taking steps as far as is possible to minimize more direct mortality. I think in general it's considered to be low with a lot of these species. Hognose snakes, for instance, they're burrowing snakes and can typically probably get out of the way. I mean, there's a ton of hognose snakes there, and they definitely burn and mow the heck out of it. In terms of box turtles, I can't say.
Okay. Thank you. And I see that Dr. Patterson typed in about the retention of trees. He says generally reduced to 20% of full canopy for crown fire potential reduction. It seems like that question was answered. Let's give folks another minute or two to type in any other questions that they have. We still have enough time. I think we could potentially open up the line, and I imagine Dr. Patterson might have a few things to say, and we might have a couple questions from folks on the phone line. So we'll just give everybody another minute or so to type in questions and see if we have any more coming into the chat box. And then I might try to unmute the phone lines. Oh, here we go. Dr. Patterson typed in, burning anytime between March and October, but most in spring and late summer, depending on drought conditions. Pre-burn protocol calls for surveying units for box turtles. So I hope that addressed that question. Can you give folks another moment to type in questions or comments?
Elizabeth Wiley did a project, I think it might have been her thesis, on box turtles at Montague, and so that's at UMass. That's a UMass document. It should be able to be found. And so she found that the box turtles were selecting thinned forest, and I bet she treated the issue of direct mortality from fire in that document. And if not, you could probably contact her.
Great. All right, let's see. I don't see yet other questions coming into the chat box. So what I'm going to do now for everybody who's on the phone line, I'm going to unmute the participant phone line, and I'm going to ask that if you're able, please mute your individual line unless you have a question. And I'm going to call on Dr. Patterson first because I imagine he has more things to say than what can be typed into a little box. So I'm going to unmute the phone line, and again, I'm asking participants to please mute your individual phone line And we'll let Dr. Patterson go first with some comments. So here we go with unmuting. All right, I've just unmuted the participant phone lines. Dr. Patterson, are you there? And do you have any 2 cents you'd like to add? We're not hearing anything yet.
You hear me now?
Yep.
I can barely hear you, but 2 cents, maybe 100 cents, but I don't have time for that. The website does cover a lot of the treatment protocols and effects on fuels and that sort of thing. And as Dave has indicated, there's been a lot of wildlife work out there, a whole bunch of lep work that Tim Simmons knows about, and Paul Goldstein and others. And monitoring and vegetation has been done since the mid-90s by Glenn Motzkin, and he's currently reserving 150 or so points that he sampled before then. The only other thing I would say is the most spectacular change from the standpoint of the general public is incredible increase in the blueberry crops, which at least in terms of spring flowering, blueberries must have some effect on bees, I would think.
Thank you for sharing that. Do other folks on the phone line have questions that you'd like to ask to our presenters? Or Joan, if you're there, if you want to, do you have any response about Dr. Patterson's comment about blueberries and bees?
Yeah, actually there are a number of early spring bees that are out that correspond with the blueberry bloom. A lot of those are the osmia and some of the early spring andrena. So the more blueberries, that's certainly going to support the populations of those bees. That's it.
Lots of other things.
Terrific. Well, I'd like to just point out that if anybody has any additional questions or follow-up questions later about protocols or issues or results, feel free to contact me or Joan. We'd be happy to entertain questions and discuss things in further detail.